Good morning and welcome to Poetry and Memoir. On the third day of the 19th Biennial Geraldine R. Dodge Festival. It's great to see you here in person, in flesh and blood, in 3 dimensions. If you did not know this, the 2020 festival was not in person, but it was virtual, it was online. And if you visit our website, dodgepoetry.org, you can actually see all the streaming sessions from 2020. And if you don't know, this session is being streamed. There's selected programming from this stage that's being streamed all over the world right now. And you can sign up after the festival also to see these after the festival. So if you go to other events and miss things here in Prudential, you can next week or next month or 6 months from now, go online and see them. So that's a great, great resource. Our signer this morning is John Izaguirre. He'll be switching off with Candice Davider. And the signing that you're seeing is also available for anyone streaming. And the captioning on that screen, you can see the person doing the captioning. That's Colleen Platt, who's been doing captioning for us for 22 years. And captioning poetry is a great challenge, and her diligence and care makes a huge difference in what you're seeing on that monitor and what folks watching at home see on their monitors. There are also shuttles, wheelchair-accessible shuttles that were donated by Rutgers University that are circulating the entire footprint. So if you know someone who needs a wheelchair to get around, those are wheelchair accessible. If you have any mobility issues and want to go to the museum or some of the other sites, the shuttle will take you there. This is the most accessible festival we've managed to produce in our entire history, so we're very happy about that. And we're grateful to Nancy Cantor, the Chancellor of Rutgers University, who donated those shuttles to us. Yes, oh wow, for sure, yeah. So if you have not yet shut off your cell phones, please shut them off. You don't want them going off during a poetry reading or a conversation. They're particularly distracting. Please don't record anything or take pictures. When you hold your phone up, you distract everyone around you. And if you put your phone on, you may not be aware of this, but it lights up your face and everyone on the stage can see that you are on your phone. So today, this conversation, there were 3 poets who have written not only beautiful lyric poetry, but also profoundly moving, deeply personal, funny, powerful, touching memoirs. And both their poetry and their memoirs push the boundaries of both genres. And yet they have both moved. They have all moved fluidly between multiple forms. They have all done this. So they're going to have a little conversation about these 2 cousins, storytelling and poetry. And we're very happy to have them here with us. We have Sandra Cisneros. Jan Beatty. Steve Kuzisto. And Caitlin. Thank you. Welcome to Poetry and Memoir.
Now what?
Now what? Yeah.
Who wants to begin?
You want me to start?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
All right. Let me tell you a quick story. So I wanted to write a memoir about growing up blind, but I wanted it to be driven by poetry because I wanted the book to have a sort of subversive ethos, which is I wanted the non-disabled to understand how beautiful disability really is and how strange. It's not what you think, right? So I sat around thinking about that, and then I said, all right, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to write a prose poem a day for a year. having to do with the strangeness of blindness and its unimagined, unforeseen, but really interesting beauties. Then, after I got those 365 prose poems, I did something that they would never tell you to do in creative writing classes, right? I just stitched them together with bits of narrative. And I discovered that this worked. So let me show you how it works. This is the prologue to the book, Planet of the Blind, the prologue. I've entered Grand Central Station with guide dog Corky, my yellow Labrador. We stand uncertain, man and dog, collecting our wits, while thousands of 5 o'clock commuters jostle around us. Beside them, Corky and I are in slow motion, like two sea lions. See, there's the poetry coming right in there, right? We've suddenly found ourselves in the ocean, and here in this railway terminal where pickpockets and knife artists roam the crowds, we're moving in a different tempo. There is something about us, the perfect poise of the dog, the uprightness of the man I don't know, a spirit maybe, fresh as the gibbous moon, the moon we've waited for, the one with the new light. So this is our railway station, a temple for Hermes. He was the god of cripples, right? We wash through the immense vault with no idea about how to find our train or the information kiosk. And just now, it doesn't matter. None of the turmoil or anxiety of being lost will reach us because moving is holy. The very motion is a breeze from Jerusalem. This blindness of mine still allows me to see colors and shapes that seem wind-blown. The great terminal is supremely lovely in its swaying hemlock darknesses and sudden pools of rose-colored electric light. We don't know where we are, and though the world is dangerous, it's also haunting in its beauty. Even to a lost man with a speck of something like seeing this minute here, just standing, taking in the air as a living circus. This is what tears of joy are for. A railway employee has offered to guide me to my train. I hold his elbow gently, Corky heeling beside us, and we descend through the tunnels under the building. I've decided to trust a stranger. Welcome to the planet of the blind, right? So, what do poets do? Image, right? What do I see? I see everything wrong. You know, I see an elephant walking down the street in front of me, you know, with its big ears. And then I get really, really close because I have to be like this. Then I see it's just some guy in a London fog raincoat, right? So it's magic all day, right? And unbelievably comical or rich or weird. Well, what do poets do, right? We're all about image. We know image, we do. And so you just begin throwing that down on the page. And before long, I've managed to create a sensorium, a picture of what it's like inside the disabled life. And I've been able to draw people in there. And as I said, that's the subversive thing behind it, right? That this really is a beautiful occasion, this life. And I can bring you inside so that you can feel it and experience it. And so for me, right, memoir and poetry are really tight because you can help the reader come richly and provocatively and engagedly inside.
Okay. Thanks. That was very cool. And I guess we will each read some and then start talking about it. American Bastard is the name of my memoir. It came out a year ago, and I had a vision. Well, that seems strange to say. Well, not really. After what you said, yeah.
No.
You're talking about all kinds of visions. I had a vision of this cover like 30 years ago. It's kind of odd. But this is an old photograph, and I'm not one to keep or think about old photographs. But I had this photograph of me at age 6 with a shotgun, without a shirt, and high tops, shooting people, which was close to my heart. But I think my personality was formed early. And I just thought if I ever could write this story, I want this on the cover, and I want to call it American Bastard, and I want it to be red and black. I don't know, I just had that in my head. And so I was thinking the story of writing the memoir is the story of what the body knows before the conscious mind follows. And that's really how it felt to me. It took me 20 years to write it, and I sent out a book proposal 20 years ago, but then wasn't able to follow up. I didn't know how to write it. I needed to do a lot more reading. I needed to grow as a writer, and I needed to do a lot more therapy. You've probably heard me talk about therapy, but I've been in therapy for a long time, and I'll continue. And I suggest you do the same. But, because we all need it, right? And so I thought I would read the beginning of this. A writer I know told me to write a welcoming introduction to this book, and I tried that, and then I hated it, and because it just didn't feel authentic to what I was trying to do. So I'll read this short introduction and the very short first part. So here's the introduction. Begins with an epigraph by a poet. So there's poetry through this manuscript, through this book. This is Lynn McMahon. The tree was shaken from the inside out, the party greenly winding the interior stair, then abruptly stilled, as if drunkenness, resting there, summoned the suddenly weighted doubt. Let's talk about the tree, the shaking. After the shaking is done, after the child finds out she's not of this family, that there's no one she looks like, shares blood with, that her name is not her name, her family is a lie, her entire life is a lie, there's no more tree. Maybe you're saying, I felt that way. I always thought I was adopted. Please let me stop you. You weren't. Talking about the mothered, motherless self, Betty Jean Lifton says, those who know their mothers cannot imagine what it's like not to know the woman who brought you into the world, what it's like to be forbidden by law to see her face, hear her voice, know her name. No one can imagine it because it is unimaginable. Maybe you're saying, I had the same thing. My mother died when I was 10. Please let me stop you. I'm sorry for your loss, but this is not that. As tough as that was, you know who you are. You have a family, a face, a bloodline, a medical history. Maybe you're saying, at least your family wanted you. Please let me stop you. Maybe you missed the part when I said the adoptee's family is a lie, her name is a lie, she has no grounding in the world. And besides, this chosen baby crap is the biggest lie to ever come down the pike. This is not about measuring sorrow, but this one's about you, how you can't seem to imagine, not even for a second, how it might be for someone who doesn't know who they are without boomeranging back to your own life. Try it. Try staying with the foreign idea that a baby is born, then sold to another person. Stay with it. There's the physical trauma of the broken bond. There's the erasure of the baby's entire history. There are these hands that have a different smell, a different DNA, reaching for the baby, calling it theirs. Stay with that for a while. No talking. I think I'll stop there for now. But I will say that thanks. Thanks. I should have said this earlier. I was born in a place called Rosalia Asylum and Maternity Hospital in the Hill District of Pittsburgh, where women would go to have their babies, leave the babies there, and it functioned as an orphanage. I was there the first year of my life, at least. So, thanks.
I have a book called A House of My Own, Stories from My Life, but it's not a memoir. And it's marketed as a memoir, so I kind of felt like a fraud coming up here with you two. But okay, if they want to call it a memoir, so be it. And I'm going to share an introduction too, but it's an introduction to a book of poetry that I had written in my youth that got reissued when I was in my 30s. So I'm going to read a little introduction, and then I'm going to read the introduction. So, introduction to the introduction. And the former is prose, and the latter introduction is a poem. And it was written for the first book of poetry, My Wicked, Wicked Ways. The reissue of my first book of poems by Knopf in 1990 demanded commentary. After publishing them with a small press the first time, I'd felt a strange postpartum depression. We'd never talked about pro-choice regarding publishing poetry when I was a student in the graduate poetry workshop. It was assumed if you wrote poems, you had to publish them, or you weren't a real poet. A given. Like being a woman meant you had to have a child to make you a real woman. Or did you? It seems to me the act of writing poetry is the opposite of publishing. So I made a vow to myself after that first book to choose to not publish poetry from then on. I'd say what I had to say publicly in fiction, but poems were to be written as if they could not be published in my lifetime. They came from such a personal place. It was the only way I could free myself to write, think with absolute freedom, without censorship. From then on, I tossed them under the bed like Emily Dickinson, and for a time, that's what I did. When I finally moved from a little publishing house to a big, 1 decade later, I was reluctant to have the early book of poems reissued, but I felt that a hardback from a big New York press would help Norma Alarcon's small press, Third Woman, which had taken a chance on me. I was asked to write a new introduction and agreed to do so, but then, of course, writer's block stepped in. The only way to get around my fear was to trick myself. After many false starts, I found the way to do this was by writing my introduction in verse. It was finished in June of 1992 in Greece on the island of Hydra, the same place I'd finished The House on Mungo Street 10 years before. The Los Angeles Times Book Review published the poem on September 6, 1992 as Poem as Preface. I want to add, as I relook at this poem now as a woman at the end of my 50s, that was then, now I'm 67, I can and do enjoy living alone. And yes, despite all my whining, I love to work. Here's two epigraphs for the poem. One's by Mary Cassatt and one's by the Mexican comedian Cantinflas. And it goes like this. I can live alone and I love to work. Mary Cassatt. Ahí está el detalle. There's the rub. Cantinflas. Gentlemen, ladies, if you please, these are my wicked poems from when the girl grief decade, my wicked nun years, so to speak. I sinned, not in the white woman way, not as Simone voyeuring the pretty slum city on a golden arm, and no, not wicked like the captain of the bad boy blood, that Hollywood hoodlum who boozed and floozed it up, hell-bent on self-destruction. Not me. Well, not much. Tell me, how does a woman like me, daughter of a daddy with a hammer and blistered feet, he'd dip into a wash tub while he ate his dinner, a woman with no birthright in the matter. What does a woman inherit that tells her how to go? My first felony, I took up with poetry. For this penalty, the rice burned. Mother warned I'd never wife. Wife? A woman like me, whose choice was rolling pin or factory. An absurd vice, this wicked, wanton writer's life. I chucked the life my father'd plucked for me, leapt into the salamander fire. A girl who'd never roamed beyond her father's rooster eye, winched the door with poetry and fled for good. And grieved I'd gone when I was so alone. In my kitchen, in the thin hour, a calendar Cassatt chanted, repeat after me, I can live alone and I love to. What a crock. Each week, the ritual grief, that decade of the knuckled knocks. I took the crooked route and liked my badness, played at mistress, tattooed an ass, lapped up my happiness from a glass. It was something, at least. I hadn't a clue. What does a woman willing to invent herself at 22 or 29 do? A woman with no who nor how. And how was I to know what was unwise? I wanted to be writer. I wanted to be happy. What's that? At 20 or 29? Love, baby, husband, the works, the big palookas of life, wanting and not wanting. Take your hands off me. I left my father's house before the brothers, vagabonded the globe like a rich white girl, got a flat. I paid for it. I kept it clean. Sometimes the silence frightened me. Sometimes the silence blessed me. It would come get me late at night, open like a window, hungry for my life. I wrote when I was sad, the flat cold, and there was no love, new, old, to distract me. No 6 brothers with their Fellini racket, no mother, father with their wise, I told you. I tell you, these are the pearls from that 10-year itch, my jewels, my colicky kids who fussed and kept me up the wicked nights when all I wanted was, with nothing in the text to tell me. But that was then, the who I was, who would become the who I am. These poems are from that hobbled when.
Is it okay if I pose a question?
Yes.
So one of the things I have found very interesting, writing both nonfiction and poetry, is that I wind up, but I think lots of writers wind up knowing more when they're done with the thing they've written than they did before. You know, that's sort of, I guess the term for that is comic irony, right? What do I know now that I didn't know before? And that's a kind of a dynamic of lyric writing, where you're writing your way forward, line by line, moment by moment, like jazz improv, right? You're finding out things. That's really what lyric writing is. And that's what the poet's memoir is, in a way. You guys want to talk about that a little bit, just as a kind of juicy bone? Juicy bone.
Sure. I mean, I loved when you were talking about walking around at the beginning and seeing different things and having it be magical and terrifying. And, you know, and to me, I mean, some of that, you know I don't know that experience, but some of it sounded like poetry. And, you know, that time when you're writing and you get lost and everything changes. And I know you guys know that space where you go deep into writing and you get lost for hours. And I love that time. And, you know, I found that was different when I was writing nonfiction.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have to say, I feel like I'm much more a poet than a nonfiction writer, but I was so driven to write this memoir that I did it. And with the nonfiction book, I just had trouble entering it. I had trouble getting in, and so I used the voices of poets, and I have a lot of epigraphs in my book, which I think of as my family of strangers, to sort of ground me in this speaking, and that's very different for me than poetry. With poetry, I'm looking to dive into the image or into a memory or something. And although I have about 5 or 6 poems in my memoir, and I felt like I needed that. I'm so tied to poetry, but I don't feel that tie to nonfiction. I found it was like, I don't know if you guys feel the same way. I felt like it was just pulling at, and it had to be true, which I really didn't like that part. That. That I would be responsible for the truth of it. I didn't like that. That felt really frightening to me, and I'm like, you know, checking it, and I had to get a lawyer, and you know, And because I put people's names, photographs, documents, and I thought, oh my God, this is scary. And I want to go back to poetry where I can hide and go underground, Does that make any sense?
No. For me, it's the opposite. I like what Steve was saying about writing prose poems and then stitching them together. That's how I write prose. I write buttons, what I call buttons, just little small pieces of nothingness, just little buttons that are complete by themselves. And then I collect them, and when I have a lot of them, I take out my button jar and rearrange them, and then I stitch them together, and then I have prose. That's how I write.
Are you talking about fiction or?
Well, any prose or fiction I do in buttons. How. But I don't write poetry that way.
There's a little joke about poetry and prose, right? That lyric poetry, which is what we write, right? We're looking for the gold nuggets, and we're finding our way, and lyric poetry is you discover your way to the place, which is why the poem is so fresh. Even 100 times you've read it, it's still fresh, right? Narrative is, of course, where the writer knows the ending. And so if you take that definition, then Paradise Lost is mostly narrative, and Moby Dick is mostly poetry, right? Can I read a little thing?
Sure, go.
Is that all right? Mm-hmm. So, working on my most recent memoir, Have Dog Will Travel, A Poet's Journey, I discovered that writing about traveling the world with a guide dog, my first one, was really about how the dog made me a more reflective person. And I didn't know the book was going to be that, right? So here's a little moment where, having gotten the dog, it's still early days, I go to New York. The guide dog school tells you don't go anywhere with your new guide dog for at least 90 days, just stay home. I went immediately to New York. And I rode the subway all over hell and back, and I went to Coney Island, and I went to Shea Stadium, and I just like jazz clubs, whatever. But here I am, I go into a computer store on 6th Avenue, one of those mega electronics joints. I wanted to purchase a laptop. As we pushed through the door, a security guard put his hand on my chest. Come in. No dog, he said. I pressed forward and the guard stepped back. Stop, he shouted, and waved his arms. Customers stared. I hate that part. My civil rights and the security guard's dignity were equally delicate. See, this is where I'm growing as a person, right? I didn't know where the guard came from, but his accent sounded West African. How could he possibly know anything about guide dogs? The store's manager hadn't given him information. All he knew was no dogs allowed, and there I was with a big-assed dog. As we stood in the doorway, I figured it would be my job to foster dignity for both of us. They hadn't taught me this at the guide dog school. They'd given me a booklet with access laws, a useful thing. I had the right to go anywhere the public went, but no one had mentioned emotional intelligence or how to engage in public mediation. So this is where the dog is making me a better person. No, it's true, right? So the dog's name is Corky. I made Corky sit. Listen, I said softly. Get the manager. This will be okay. This is a special dog for the blind. I wanted to turn our misunderstanding into something respectful. I like this little moment. The manager was one of those guys you see all the time in big city stores, sadder than his customers, red-faced and put upon. He had a scoured toughness. He approached and began shouting at the guard, "It's a seeing-eye dog, for God's sakes. Let him in. Sorry." My fight or flee rush was subsiding. I wanted all three of us to experience kindness. I was in a Manhattan electronics store and dignity was in peril. It would have been easy to say, F it, and look out for myself alone. I'd gotten into the store. I was angry. I could have pitched a fit, but I didn't feel like doing that. The guard's name was Ekweme. My name was Stephen. The manager's name was Phil. Listen, I said, dogs for the blind are not common. You don't see them every day. This is Corky. She's very smart. I let my voice become soft. Ekweme and Phil both petted Corky. A customer approached, said, I've raised puppies for the guide dog school. Best dogs in the world. I like this sentence too. Phil seemed suddenly pleased, as if he too was philanthropic, or could be someday. Ekweme admitted he loved dogs. Outside, with a computer under my arm, I reckoned life with Corky was more complex than just a story of freedom. Ekweme and Phil would become legion in my travels, but I didn't know it yet. What I did know was reflected in a quote I'd always loved from Martin Luther King Jr., quote, an individual has not started living until he can rise above the narrow confines of his individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity. I sensed that having a service dog meant something more than honoring my own rights. Take the first step in faith, said Dr. King. You don't have to see the whole staircase. Just take the first step.
Very nice.
So, thank you. That's that comic irony thing where, you're able to step back and look at your life from a little distance, and you get this sense that, I was growing. The dog was helping me grow. Mm-hmm. Well, but that's true with each of our paragraphs in nonfiction, I think, as written by poets, that it's about spirit work, even if we don't call it that. It's about becoming more flexible, becoming a better soul dancer, right? I think that's one of the things I've discovered, writing nonfiction, that there's space in there to examine, well, who the hell am I now?
Yeah.
Right?
Did you say spirit work?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I don't mean that in any kind of a ecumenical
Yeah.
way,
I just didn't know what you said. Yeah, I agree. I agree. With the growing, I feel like, I'm a different person after writing this book. I'm not sure.
Exactly, right?
I'm not sure I could articulate what happened, but I'm going to read a short piece.
Good.
I dedicated the book to, this is for the lost ones who never knew where they came from. This is against the ones who pretended the loss never happened. And this short beginning is, I can't say it's a memory, but it's an imagining of what it might have been like in the asylum as an infant. And I did have dreams, and I did research, and there's photographs, but I kept having these dreams about these white iron, cribs.
Yeah.
And when I found the photos of the asylum, they were these white cast iron cribs, and that was scary, how could I know that?
Yep.
Anyway, this is called After the Tearing and Rolling. After the tearing and rolling, you're an infant somewhere in a crib in a room full of cribs. Someone is taking care of you. You don't know who. Who is the person who picks you up? Is it a woman? Is it a nun? There's no story in sight, no same loving face, blood of my blood face. The smells, the feel of the rolling and tearing are gone where? No face, who has your face, no way of knowing who is who, what hands are these, why are they different every time? There's no bonding taking place. The story is fractured here and forever after. Then strangers come to gaze at you, touch you, wonder about you. They decide to pluck you out of there and make you theirs. These strangers will take your name away and hide it. The government will cooperate. It will take months and months for this baby trade to be completed, a baby in exchange for money. Meanwhile, someone is feeding you. Is it a kind person? What do they smell like? You will never know these hands again. You will be taken to a strange place. People will start calling you the lucky one, the chosen baby. No one sees that your story is gone, that you are being handed off like a football. From now on, everyone will pretend that your first story never existed. They will act and want you to act as if you are one of them, their blood, their faces, their world. You know that to survive, you will have to do this, you will have to pass. But your new mother has dark hair and brown eyes. Your father has dark hair. Their noses are not like yours. Your white blonde hair shines sickly like the odd light in a bad painting. Later, you look at your cousins. They have beautiful long eyelashes, all of them the same. You value how others resemble others. You long for it. In first grade, you refuse to make a family tree. Your parents and teachers suggest you make one based on your new family. You refuse.
Yeah. That's exactly what we're talking about, right? That, absolutely.
Well, I guess I have to say something. It's my turn. Well, I didn't know I was writing anything autobiographical when I wrote these because I didn't know I was writing a book. I just go in front of an audience and I say, okay, how old are they? And I'll write something for them. So I wrote them for a specific audience, each one, and then I gathered them all together, and they call it a memoir, but I call it Stories from My Life. And when I'm not concerned about who's going to read this, I don't get blocked. But if I'm writing something for the New York Times, then I can't write. So I have to always trick myself as if I'm writing a poem or nobody's going to see this or whatever. So I was speaking with some high school students in San Antonio, Texas, at one of the MacArturo gatherings. The MacArturos are a group of Latino MacArthur winners that I had organized to come to our town. They've won for different areas of expertise, maybe genetic science or labor organizer or booksellers. And they're very generous people. So when I asked them if they would come to San Antonio and talk to our young people, they all said yes. And that's how the MacArturos happened. And I was reading with two other MacArthur winners in the community in the library in San Antonio. And I wrote this specifically for these group of visiting students, many of which were from at-risk classes, so I wanted to motivate them. And I brought, this is before PowerPoint, so you had to be the PowerPoint yourself, and I brought a big blow-up of my 5th grade report card. Oh, wrong glasses. When I was in 5th grade, my teacher, Sister Mary Regina Immaculata of the Most Holy Ghost Most High, asked to see my mother. This was a big deal. It meant I had done something awful, but I couldn't remember what awful thing I'd done. Now what? Mother said, disgusted. Dinner would be late. She would have to walk over to my school and walk back, and I'd have to go with her. My 2 older brothers would be ordered to take care of the 4 younger. The last time they'd done that, the twins had wound up at the police station, and they were only 5 years old. Father would come home from work tired, hungry, and with his feet throbbing. Mother, in a terrible mood, would hurl words at anyone who got in her way. Thanks to me, the world was thrown into chaos. The complaint from Sister Mary Gina, Most Immaculata of the Holy Ghost Most High, was this: your daughter is a daydreamer. What could I say? It was true. When my teacher called on me, I seldom knew where we were. But it was also true that the class was a mix of 47 noisy kids from a mix of grade levels, too much for one tired teacher to deal with. Often in a day there were moments when you could drift away on a daydream, and often I took that route, staring out the window at a cloud, a coral geranium petal, or at Salvador, the boy who sat in front of me, whose wrinkled shirt and dirty collar made me wonder why his mama didn't take better care of him. I thought and thought about Salvador a lot back then, and imagined he lived with a family of little brothers, and maybe these little brothers made his mama too busy to send Salvador to school in a clean pressed shirt. I imagined Salvador getting up early to help with the babies. I was sure I knew where Salvador lived, over on Western Avenue near Flournoy Street, in a Chicago neighborhood worse than ours, near my Aunt Timo, who, like the woman who lived in a shoe, had so many children she didn't know what to do. And just when I could imagine Salvador tumbling out of bed, undressing himself in his wrinkled shirt, helping his mama feed the babies cornflakes from a tin cup, combing his hair with water, rushing to get to school, this was exactly when the teacher would call on me. I don't remember much else about that 5th grade year, except things I wish I could forget. Daydreamer, a word worse than a stick or a stone. It broke more than bones. I felt ashamed to raise my hand for the rest of the school year until, by divine providence, our pipes froze the following winter, and we had to move to another neighborhood, another school, one with kind, compassionate lay teachers and nuns who discovered I was an artist and writer. But before that bright eureka, I hid inside myself and drew and wrote in secret, never volunteering an answer in class because I assumed if I thought of it, it must be wrong. It's funny, with all of the moves in my life, that horrible report card from 5th grade survived to remind me of who I used to be. I have only to look at the constellations of C's and D's to remember how others saw me and how I once saw myself. Too bad there was no grade for art, or I would have gotten an A. Too bad there was no credit for the 7 or 8 books I borrowed every week from the public library. Who knew this was important to bring to the attention of someone like Sister Mary Regina Immaculata of the Holy Ghost Most High? In the 40th year of my life, I received a MacArthur Fellowship, the so-called Genius Grant, which is like an Academy Award for the story of your life. That's how I explained it to my mother, who didn't understand at first. What it finally made me realize was this: I have always been a daydreamer, and that's a lucky thing for a writer. Because what is a daydreamer if not another word for thinker, visionary, intuitive? All wonderful words synonymous with girl. And there's an illustration of what I looked like at that time and a picture of my report card.
How are we doing on time?
I'm not sure.
I don't know.
Should we
Should we get questions?
should we open this
Yeah, I
up for
think we should take
questions?
questions. That's
Or
fun.
am I, jumping in too soon?
Oh, I like questions. It's like playing volleyball.
Well, one cool thing about memoir as written by poets, or poetry that partakes of memoir, right? That it's going to analyze the life behind the curtain, is that because we're poets, we can really screw around with the way the story gets told. It used to be, right, that if people who wrote memoirs were old admirals,
Or
on
movie
their
stars.
deathbeds, right, soaking their teeth in a glass, and it ran like a timeline. I was born in a log cabin, and here I am now in a castle, and all the things that happened in between, right? But memoir as written by poets, Mary Carr, Lucy Grayley, it takes the story and spins it in really interesting ways so that we get at the strangeness of life.
Well, I agree. And there's still some of those admirals out there. And when I was trying to get my book published, and I was talking to some agents, they wanted chronology. They wanted me to tell the story from the beginning in order. And I couldn't do it.
Yeah, because it stinks.
Yeah. I wasn't interested, and I couldn't remember big hunks of my life, and I didn't want to, and yeah. So I needed to go somewhere else, and the only way I could do it was in a leaping way. Although an interesting thing, and I don't know if this happened with you or with you, Sandra, that people keep telling me that my book isn't prose, it's poetry, and they're serious, and I'm like, no, it's prose. This is the way I write prose, and so there are a couple poems in there.
Sure.
But I think it's based on what you're saying. Like it's a different, it's leaping and it's lyrical, but it's prose.
I think the way you answer that is you go, it's a delivery system.
It's what?
It's a delivery system.
Yeah.
Right. It's not poetry. It's not prose. It's a delivery system.
I have a question.
Yay.
Okay.
Oh,
So I love the way you are all swirling things around, and I've noticed that there's a word fiction, and there's a word nonfiction. So nonfiction being what is not fiction, but it seems like poetry is all of that. There's the true story, so-called, but there's no word that says this is a factual story, and it seems like everything you're talking about is a whole mix of how we imagine our lives. So I was just wondering, in terms of crossing boundaries and how you all are clearly doing that, why do we put things in those categories?
because it's marketed by our publisher. Like if I told them I was writing poetry, it's like, oh, I'm writing a novel. So, it's about marketing, I believe, unless you want to disagree with me.
Well, my family comes from Finland, and you may know that the Finns have an epic poem called Kalevala, and it was put together in the 19th century by a homeopathic doctor who skied around in the woods looking for magic mushrooms, and he discovered people living in the woods who were still telling oral tradition stories that went back 1,000 years. And so he collected those stories and made this thing, Kalevala. It's about shamans and magicians in the woods. What's interesting is that in ancient times, is it poetry, is it prose, didn't matter. But with the advent of the printing press, we developed a taxonomic system. And we've been living with that ever since. But I think the poets are they're twisting it, right? And I think that bending and reshaping genre is really about what you do when you hail from a historically marginalized position. Each one of us hails from a historically marginalized place. And we haven't been allowed to tell our stories. I don't know about I can't assume for you, but I've been told all my life because I'm blind and I went to public school before the ADA, you don't belong here. You don't belong here. You don't belong here. Sorry, you don't belong here. And in a certain way, at a certain point, as a writer, as an artist, you decide to say, screw you.
Dan, I have a question. Over
Was it
here.
all right that I said that?
Oh, sure.
All right, okay.
My question's for Jan. How do you deal with the fear, or how did you deal with the fear of coming out of hiding and writing the memoir?
Do you mean, I can't see you, where are you?
Just right here.
Oh, okay.
Over here.
Oh, okay, sorry. Do you mean in particular regarding adoption, or?
Just overall, like when you were talking about like, oh, this is just so uncomfortable. Yeah, just overall, not just the adoption, just all of like putting yourself out there.
Yeah.
Because there's vulnerability in it, right?
Yeah.
A lot.
Boy, I'll tell you what. Yeah, I've never felt so vulnerable as when I was writing this book, and and I do feel like that has changed me in a good way. I can't seem to go back to feeling not vulnerable, and that's okay. I'm sort of getting used to it, but like I said, it took me 20 years to write the book. I needed to, as I said, grow as a writer. I've read a lot of memoirs, and I didn't like a lot of them, but I found some that I did like, and so I used those as a pattern. And I had notes from years and years. During those 20 years, I kept notes in journals, and because I knew I couldn't write it yet, but maybe one day I could. And I really never knew if I could ever write it or get it published, but I just kept keeping notes. So I had those notes, I had this model, but I was driven. There was something, I was just driven. I had and I think that helps when you're writing a memoir or writing anything. What drove me to write the memoir was I was really upset with the way the culture deals with adoption, and I was not okay. I'm not okay with it.
Thank you so much.
And I'm not against adoption at all, but I just want to say, look, when you adopt, these babies don't belong to you, and they're not yours. And I hate that sentence that you hear so often. Oh, when I saw her, I knew she was mine. Well, she's not yours. She's not yours. And instead of saying, I'm your mother now, you need to say, I'm sorry for your loss. So I just want that adjustment. I want that wider view to recognize that the adoptees we need to know where we came from. We need our names. I still don't have my medical history. Well, I don't think I'm going to get it now, but and that affects all my medical decisions, especially getting older. But so that was the drive, and I just wanted to say, look, this isn't okay, you know. But I was terrified because I was really terrified when I started reading from this book because I was afraid of, you know, that people would attack me or that adoptive parents would come after me, but it hasn't been like that. And I'm okay if people disagree and are offended, I can deal with that. But so I think part of it is getting solid where you are and knowing why you're writing something and taking your time. We talked about that in the last session. Take your time, get solid, and just keep working. If you do it quickly, I don't think it's going to work. So.
I have a question for Stephen, but for anyone who wants to answer it. Your work strikes me as imagining the other superbly, especially overcoming anger, being thwarted. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little about that process of imagining the other so beautifully, whether it is the dog or the people in the situations you described, and also giving voice to the other in a voice that's quite different from the one you speak and write in. Thank you.
That's a really interesting question. So, a poem that I've always liked, that actually was introduced to me by Robert Bly some years ago, is a little poem by a 20th century Italian poet from Sicily who had the remarkable name Salvatore Quasimodo. But this little poem is really remarkable, okay? And it's very short. It goes, each of us is alone at the center of the earth, pierced by a ray of sunlight. And suddenly, it's evening. I think that's the most perfect existential haiku ever. For each of us is inside this earthen body, and we have this brief moment of light, and then it's gone. At the core, this is a beautiful, astonishing life. It is also lonely and terrifying. Emotional candor requires that we as poets and literary writers open the door to that strange self-to-self dichotomy that is this business of being alive and walking around in these wildly improbable bodies. I think about this stuff all the time. And I know they do too, you know. And I know you all do too. Yeah, the poems of Salvatore Quasimodo are fabulous.
This is Dan. I have a question for everybody. Well, I'm a poet who's been working on a memoir for a long time, so thank you, Jan, for that encouragement to keep going. You mentioned certain memoirs that kind of sparked you or became models for you. And Sandra, your House on Mango Street is really what made me excited about working on a memoir, so thank you. What have been the models for each of you that really got you turned on to the idea of writing a memoir?
I mean, the thing that helped me the most, I think, was Nick Flynn's memoirs. I mean, Another Bullshit Night in Suck City helped me a lot because the structure of that was, the many chapters, the short chapters, and the dealing with trauma in that book, I thought was really good. And I mean, he has a couple memoirs. And reading Sandra's work always helps
And
me.
reading your work makes me run for my pen. It's mutual.
Yeah, it's a love fest, and but seriously, years and years ago, I had a radio show called Prosody. I interviewed both of these guys on my radio show years ago. I was lucky enough to do that, but I wanted to interview Sandra Cisneros to hear her poetry, and she says, "Poetry. Everybody wants to hear my prose." I'm like, "No, I want to hear your poetry."
That's so great. Thank you.
and everything that you write, inspires me. And
Well, I'm told I write poetry that's narrative and narrative that's poetic.
and narrative is poetic.
Yeah, narrative that's like poetry, and my poetry is like story. So
Whatever they call it, it's really good.
Let's have a round of applause for our panelists. Sandra Cisneros, Jan Beatty, Steve Kuzisto. Thank you so much.
Jan, this is like Maria Callas.
There's a 20-minute intermission, and then there'll be a song cycle, Endangered, and poetry collaboration with Thomas Danker and the True Groove All-Stars and 8 poets. And there are events in other venues, so you've got about a 20-minute break. But an astonishing event is about to happen here in about 20 minutes. Let's say one last round of gratitude for our guests. And for Caitlin.